without any further ado, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Maturo. I am a research coordinator at ILAN for the Quebec Relations Project, and I'll be leading the webinar today. So a big thank you to all of you for joining us. Just a few notes before we proceed any further, sort of more on the technical end of things. Not such a big deal since we're not a huge number of participants, but it is preferable if you keep your video off and your microphones muted during the session, just because it helps save on bandwidth, so we don't run the risk of having choppy audio or video. If for some reason the Zoom session is interrupted, hasn't happened yet, knock on wood, but should such a thing arise, I will send another Zoom link via email, so you would just have to wait for that. And a last note, this session will be recorded for archival purposes. We won't be sharing any part of the recording that contains the faces, voices, written words, or names of our participants unless we have obtained their written consent. It's really just to have an archival recording that we can share on our website at a later date so you can review it or share it with your colleagues. So as I said, welcome. Welcome to all our attendees, and welcome to a few members of the ILAN team who are helping me out today. So first, welcome to Guy Rogers, who is ILAN's Executive Director, as well as the Project Manager for Quebec Relations. And in a few moments, Guy will be saying a few words about the project, just to fill you in on the kind of work that we're doing. A welcome as well to June Park, who is our grant writing consultant, who also offers consulting services for organizations who are going through the process of registering as not-for-profits. So June, a little later on, we'll just talk to you briefly about some of the assistance that we can provide that can help simplify things for you. And last but certainly not least is Swati Khanna, who is ILAN's program manager, who has once again graciously offered to help moderate our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So thank you as always, Swati. So this is the fifth in our series of webinars that are offered through Quebec Relations. So sort of simply put, Quebec Relations is a project that's all about helping arts and culture organizations access new funding through the provincial government. Since quarantine began, we've really been focusing on using Zoom to offer more presentations, more sort of workshops to really support the community during COVID-19. So each month we've been presenting 1 to 2 sessions on a range of topics that sort of generally relate to funding for arts organizations. Today is a bit of a slightly different approach, perhaps a prequel to our other sessions, in that whereas we usually do work that caters to existing organizations, today we'll be discussing the process for actually becoming a not-for-profit organization. So we'll also be looking at some of the funding options that become available to you once you have registered, and also how we can support you in doing that. So as always with these sessions, we welcome your feedback. We really want to hear what you think about the work we're doing. So please do let us know. It'll help us sort of make these as responsive to you as possible moving forward. Just a quick outline of how this is going to work before we get into the main material. So first, Guy is going to provide a bit of background on the Quebec Relations Project. Some of you may already be familiar with the work we're doing, but he'll make sure we're all on the same page with that. Then I'm going to go over the basics of not-for-profit organizations, sort of what distinguishes them from other entities, why people register, and also sort of the pros and cons to help you decide if it is actually right for you. So I'll then walk you through the steps on how to register, so the documents that you'll need to do so, as well as your ongoing responsibilities once you actually have gone through the process. So you get sort of a complete idea of what is required to become a not-for-profit organization. And I'll also provide some useful examples of tools and templates that'll help you get started so you're not starting from scratch. I'll finish up with a brief discussion of some of the grants that will become available to you once you're registered, as well as how we in Quebec Relations can help you register as a not-for-profit and then subsequently apply for that funding. So at that point, I'll ask June to say a few words about how that will work. And lastly, as always, we'll close off with a brief question period. Usually how this works is we just ask that you type your questions in the chat box throughout the session as they come up. Swati will record those and then pass those along to me. We'll get through as many of them at the end of the session as we can. If we run out of time, of course, please just get in touch via email. I'm happy to continue the conversation there. So this session is really going to serve as an overview. I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail, but hopefully it will be a solid introduction to you just to know how the process works, so you can start considering your options from there. We do have a lot to cover. I'll try to move through it at a decent pace, but not go too fast. But if you find I'm moving too fast, please just let me know in the chat. And of course, this may seem like a lot of information, but I will be sharing the slides afterwards via email. That will include useful links that will help you get started. And of course, we'll also be uploading an archival recording of this so you can rewatch it if that will be beneficial for you. So with that said, I'll hand things over to Guy to give us a bit of an introduction to Quebec relations.
All right, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Nick. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This particular project, Quebec Relations, was funded by the new Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. And they are concerned about the well-being, the integration of English speakers in general in Quebec. And the head of the Secretariat asked me if there was any particular problem for English-speaking artists to access provincial funding. And I told him that it's hard to discern perceptions from reality, but there is a perception that information is not always available, period, rarely available in English. And there do seem to be some barriers, which again, may be partly real, partly perceived. So they funded Elan for 2.5 years to go out and identify all of the existing funding in Quebec. So Nick has done a fantastic job of identifying more than 100 funding programs, the obvious suspects, CALC, SODEC, the Ministry of Culture, but many others as well. And then he created one-pagers, quite detailed, all of the useful information, translated them to English, put them on a web page. He's been doing webinars, individual consultations, and we're encouraging people to actually write applications so that then we can monitor the results to see if there are any systemic problems with the system. So today, as Nick said, we're sort of taking a step backwards because most of the programs, in fact, all of them that have been identified in the project so far are available to incorporated organizations. So today is about providing you with the information to decide if incorporation makes sense for you, and if you decide that incorporation makes sense, how to go about it. And what I really want to stress is that we are funded to support you for the coming period. Who knows when this kind of resource will ever be available again? We're hoping that we can extend the funding for 2 or 3 years, but there's never a guarantee. There is a guarantee that we have the support right now. So Nick, June, other people on the team are there to help you get incorporated, to write applications, to identify funding. So I strongly urge you to not be shy, to take advantage of this during the period ahead. And that being said, I'm going to hand you back to Nick and to June. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Guy. And yeah, I really want to echo what Guy said there. Please don't be shy. The process starts with just sort of knowing how this works. That's what today's webinar is about, but really it's just the beginning. We want to help you. So it's all about just getting in touch, and we can sort of continue the process from there. So we'll move into sort of the main event here, which is actually talking about not-for-profits, learning a bit about what they are, sort of why people register, just so we understand kind of the basic concepts. So simply put, a not-for-profit organization is a legal entity that is administered entirely towards not-for-profit goals. So if we kind of unpack what that means, because it's sort of seems fairly straightforward, but we should consider the implications of that. Legal entity means there's a formal process for creating that entity. You can't just sort of wake up tomorrow and decide you're going to become a not-for-profit. The concept of administration suggests that there's some kind of an organizational structure that is required to be put in place to then pursue those goals. You can't register without having some sort of organizational structure that will allow you to sort of pursue those goals. So as a legal entity, a not-for-profit organization can own or rent property and hold a bank account in its own name, rather than all that having to be done sort of in the name of a single individual associated with the group. Not-for-profits can operate in the arts and culture sector, certainly, but also across a variety of other sectors, as long as they're pursuing a goal that is a social good. And what differentiates a not-for-profit from any other corporation? This probably won't surprise you. It's right there in the name. The main goal of these kinds of organizations is not to generate profit. It's to provide a particular kind of service, or as I mentioned, a social good. But that doesn't mean that they don't generate revenue or profit per se. So often in my consultations, I'll be talking with arts organizations, and when I ask if they're registered as a not-for-profit, they'll say, I'm not a not-for-profit, but I don't make any money, which is, it's a joke that gets me every time, but really a not-for-profit can generate a profit. It's really just about how that profit is used. So it cannot be reinvested towards furthering the organization's goals, it must be reinvested towards furthering the organization's goals rather than being paid out in dividends or what have you to sort of administrators, members, or shareholders. In fact, having a strong financial footing is really crucial to the stability and success of any organization, both in its ability just to sort of operate day to day, but also in how likely funders are to want to support your work. Before we move on, just since we're on the topic of finances and registration here, I thought it'd make sense to sort of briefly discuss charities and registering for charitable status. It's not uncommon, I think, for people to sort of consider charities and not-for-profits to be sort of roughly interchangeable terms, but it's important to note that they're not actually the same thing. In fact, the Canada Revenue Agency has a really handy chart for being able to tell the difference. I've linked to that in the slides. But all that to say, just because you've registered as a not-for-profit doesn't mean you have charitable status. You can nevertheless seek charitable status as a not-for-profit, but it is a separate process. And in fact, just because you apply for it doesn't mean you'll actually get it. In fact, Guy has told me that Elan has actually applied for it in the past and was not able to receive it sort of years ago. So depending on certain circumstances, you cannot automatically bank on receiving that. In terms of why an organization would want to pursue charitable status, there are several, but sort of the main one is being able to issue tax receipts for donations that you've received. If that's something you'd like to learn more about, I've included a couple of useful links in the slides. But beyond that, I'm certainly happy to discuss that further, either via email or a consultation. And if it's something that you're interested in pursuing, June Park is also available to offer you some assistance in that process, again, subsidized through the Quebec relations process. So be sure to get in touch if you'd like to know more. So now that you know sort of the basics of what a not-for-profit is and does, as well as what it is not, some of you may be thinking, well, that really sounds like what I need for my work. What is the catch? Or maybe others are thinking, what good is that going to do me? Why should I bother? Those are both valid questions depending on your situation. We should deal with those in greater detail before we get on to the sort of how part of this presentation. So let's quickly look at the pros and cons related to registering as a not-for-profit. The first pro, as I alluded to previously, given the context of today's webinar, the most pertinent benefit is probably the greater range of funding that you'll be eligible for. That's not only in terms of the options for funding, in terms of certain kinds of activities that you'll now be able to access, like organizational development, but it's also funding outside the arts and culture sector. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the main category of funding that is solely available to organizations is operating or core funding. This is multi-year funding that can help cover the costs of your organization's day-to-day activities rather than just sort of one-off projects or events. Obviously, that sounds great. It sounds like what everybody wants. But what's important to keep in mind there is that just because you register as a not-for-profit doesn't mean next year you're just sort of automatically going to fall backwards into operating funding. These are highly competitive programs. They usually require several years of operation at a fairly high level. And the total amount of funding that funders sort of earmark for these types of programs is more limited compared to what they set aside for project funding. That being said, if this is a goal for the future for you, I do think it's really important to start building your track record as an organization so that you can demonstrate stability and results in the work you're doing. You'll also certainly want to have a few project grants under your belt to be able to build a relationship with funders and demonstrate that you can reliably deliver results for your proposed projects. When it comes to sort of project grants, there are new options available to you as an organization as well. For funding bodies like Canada Council, most programs are available to individual artists as well as collectives and organizations. But there are some more specific programs which are only available to organizations, including several of their Arts Across Canada programs, which offer grants for sort of presenting works. When it comes to applying for provincial funding through, let's say, CALC, there are several similar programs available when it comes to what is for organizations and what is for individuals and collectives. But they are administered in separate categories with different criteria. So of course, there are also new programs that become available to you as well for organizations. So even for those programs which are open to all applicants, one more thing to keep in mind is that the funding amounts available to organizations are often more significant just because they have sort of the capacity to do more than a single individual. So to summarize, if the kinds of grants that are available to you now aren't responsive to your particular needs, or if the funding amounts are sort of less than your projects necessitate, or even if you wanted to start building towards the kind of multi-year core funding that you can get in the future, registering as a not-for-profit is definitely worth pursuing. The second main advantage is the legal separation between an organization and its members or administrators. So as I mentioned, a not-for-profit can open a bank account or hold property in its own name. So consequently, there's a limited liability for members. So for example, any debts accrued by an organization aren't necessarily tethered to one single individual. Third, that legal separation from members also ensures a structure that is going to be able to last as members and administrators come and go. So having everything registered under the organization's name means that members can sort of walk away without having to transfer ownership or open a new bank account, etc. So if the long-term stability of your work is important and you foresee that work sort of ongoing regardless of your own participation in the project, not-for-profit status will help you do that. Lastly, and this might surprise you, one of the things that works towards registering is the fact that it's relatively straightforward to do. The process is a lot less complicated and time-consuming than you might think, and all the more so because we're here to help you do that. So why not take advantage of that extra help? So I would say those are the four main advantages, and they're fairly significant ones depending on the work you're trying to do, both now and in the future. But what about the disadvantages? Honestly, in sort of researching and preparing this presentation, I was not able to put together many, and they're not so significant by comparison to what I've just discussed, but they are worth considering nevertheless. So first, you really need to consider the time, energy, and capacity required to do this versus the payoff, and that will obviously vary depending on your situation. So to begin with, as I mentioned, the process of registering and preparing the necessary documents is not so complex, but obviously it does require an investment of time and attention. But more importantly, there's ongoing work that's required to keep a not-for-profit organization running soundly. And obviously that's time and energy that's taken away from your artistic work. So if, for example, you're an emerging artist or collective and you're just starting to establish yourself, maybe the time that you'd be spending on administration would be better allocated to your actual practice to help you build a body of work. But even then, I don't want to generalize too much. It really does depend on your situation, the work you're trying to do, and also your plans beyond just the short term. So don't let that put you off necessarily. And second, there are some costs involved, both upfront and for your annual registration renewal. We'll talk about those specific amounts a little later on. They aren't prohibitively expensive, but again, just a question of a cost-benefit analysis for your situation. and also, I suppose, offset by your plans to pursue funding as an organization down the line. So overall, as you can see, sort of based on my strained attempts to find some reasons not to register, depending on your situation, the benefits to incorporation likely really outweigh the downsides. So if it's something you've considered in the past but been put off because you thought the process would be too complicated, don't let that be a reason not to do it. Try to assess your goals, your needs, and your capacity. And if you need help making that decision, by all means, reach out to us for some guidance. Okay, so you've weighed the pros and cons and you've decided either not-for-profit status is right for you, or you've signed out of this Zoom call, which I can see based on the number of participants, I don't think anybody has done, so that's a great sign. So time to start filling out some forms, right? Not necessarily. There is one more important decision you'll need to sort out before you actually get to that step. So namely, should you incorporate federally or provincially? On a practical level, there's really not much, not much of a huge difference in the registration process depending on which you choose. But your choice does have some implications for your organization and really will depend on where you see yourself being primarily active. So sort of the main consideration will be whether you intend to operate Canada-wide or just within Quebec. If you'll be mostly working on a local level, registering provincially is probably sufficient. For federal incorporation, you'll also need to be aware of any conflicts when it comes to registering the name you've selected. When you're doing that provincially, you just have to sort of keep in mind other corporations within the province. If you're doing that federally, you'll have to keep in mind not just federal corporations, but also names that have been registered in all of the provinces. So of course, another consideration is that in Quebec, you're going to have to fill out those forms in French. So that's something to keep in mind depending on your proficiency and your comfort level in doing so. Given that we'll be focusing on provincial funding today, and we sort of generally have a provincial theme to these presentations, we'll be walking you through the provincial registration process. But as I mentioned, there's not such a huge difference between the two. And there are links in the slides that will show you the steps for federal incorporation if you're interested. So, all right, now we're on to kind of the main event here, the actual process of incorporation. We'll start by going over some of the things you need to have prepared in advance of actually filing the necessary forms. So first, it's really important to have a clear mandate for your organization in mind. So that means asking yourself, what is it that you actually want to do? What is the social good that your organization addresses? This will help guide you when preparing some of your important documents later on. In order to register your organization, you'll also need to select at least 3 board members. So beyond just picking any old person you know who's available, you really want to give some thought to making sure that you're selecting people who are like-minded and who will be dedicated to the mandate that you're establishing. It's also important to note that for calc eligibility, the majority of your board members need to either be Canadian citizens who live in Quebec or who have permanent resident status in the province. So please do keep that in mind. The next step before proceeding any further is that you'll have to draft your organization's bylaws. So this is admittedly a little more involved and time-consuming, but we can help you through this, and there are other useful resources to help you with that. So these bylaws essentially serve as the rules for how your organization is governed. They set the expectations for conduct for your administrators, your board, and your membership. So for instance, bylaws should state the conditions for membership, as well as how governance decisions are made. They can also define when the organization's annual general meeting is held and how elections for the board are going to take place, things of that nature. So the important thing to really keep in mind here is to emphasize clarity, consistency, and transparency to make sure everybody in your organization is on the same page. Ideally, you want to draft these in such a way that you won't have to make any changes in the immediate future. If you do need to make those changes down the line, amended bylaws will have to be prepared by your board and then presented to members at either an annual or special general meeting, at which point they can be voted through on a simple majority. But that is a process that you'll have to keep in mind if you do want to make any changes. Lastly, you'll have to demonstrate that the name you've selected for your organization is available, so you'll need to carry out a name search. As I mentioned, this is a simpler process to undertake provincially. In Quebec, this can be done for free via the Registraire des Entreprises website. However, if you want to ensure that no one takes that name while your registration is being processed, rather than just sending in that name search report, you can actually reserve the name for 90 days at a cost of $22. Federally or in other provinces, you can use Corporation Canada's Nuance system, although generating that report will cost $13.80. Not such a huge investment, but something to keep in mind. Okay, so you've got those documents prepared. Now you can proceed with submitting your registration. So if you're registering provincially, you can do so with the steps listed on the Registraire des Entreprises website. There's a link to those in the slides. If you're doing it federally, you can proceed through the Corporations Canada's website. As I mentioned, I'll continue to use the provincial method for our example today. So now you simply have to fill out the Registraire's RE303 form, which is on their website. This has to be done in French, but there is an English version that is available for reference, so you can compare those and go back and forth. The form also includes a template for a sworn statement that you'll need to submit attesting to the accuracy of your application. So that'll need to be filled out by one of the people who have signed the form and then subsequently notarized after that. So your responses to this form, how you fill it out, will determine the content of your organization's articles of incorporation, sometimes called letters patent or just articles, which will then be issued by the Registraire after they have processed your registration. So this is basically a document that contains key information about your organization, how it functions, and also just documents the fact that your organization is registered. They can be quite standard, but they can also deviate if you do need to add special provisions that are particular to your situation. And much like your bylaws, they need to be worded in such a way that it keeps future options open, because amending them does cost between $200 and $300. So for example, if your organization changes its head office or its general mission, it must obtain the approval of its board and its membership, and then apply to the enterprise registrar for supplementary articles or letters patent. So finally, along with this signed and notarized document, you'll need to attach your name, search report, and provide payment. So the cost of the initial provincial registration is $172 according to the latest fee chart on the Registraire's website. Federally, if you submit online, it's $200. If you submit by mail, it's $250. And then lastly, for provincial registration, once you've submitted that form, within 60 days, you'll need to complete an initial declaration form. I have linked to that in the slides, and this can be filled out via the Registraire's website. If you're registering federally, you don't have to do this final step. You simply submit that registration and payment, and you're good to go. So now that you have a sense of those steps and how the process works, some of you are probably asking yourself questions like, okay, but how do I write my bylaws? Or I know that I need to have, sort of 3 board members, but how do I oversee a board of directors? Fear not, because there are lots of useful templates and models that are available to help you get you started and sort of guide you along the way. The first set of these is available through Corporations Canada. They have a couple of useful tools. First, they provide you with models for articles of incorporation, so you can see what sort of the finished product looks like after you've submitted your form, and then you get those back. So yes, remember, you don't have to write those, but they are produced based on how you fill out your registration form. But Corporations Canada also gives you a couple of other useful tools. First, they give you models for writing your own bylaws, so sort of templates that you can look at to see what the finished product looks like. But they also have a really useful tool called the Bylaw Builder. So this tool is going to walk you through each section of the bylaw template. It'll allow you to either select from a few predetermined options, draft your own text for that section, or omit that section altogether if it doesn't apply to you. When you're done, you simply click the Generate Bylaws button at the bottom of the page, and it'll generate the text for you, which you can then copy and paste into your own document. So super useful to get started. Another set of really useful tools is available from an organization based here in Montreal called La Machinerie des Arts, or the Machinery. So they've been doing some really great work to put together resources for the arts community, including a great toolbox for professional artists and organizations. So this toolbox includes 130 tools in French, but Alain has been a very proud partner with the Machinerie and others in the English-speaking community to translate 85 of these tools into English. Before we actually take a look at the most useful of these tools, I do want to just note that ordinarily to access these, you would need to be a paid member of the Machinery. But if you are an Alain member, you automatically get 1 year of free access to the toolbox. So great news if you're an Alain member. If you're not, our memberships are pay what you can, and they come with a lot of benefits in addition to this. So really all the more reason to sign up. I've included a link to our membership page in the slides. Really worth considering given that it's a pay what you can model. And for the Machinery's tools alone, frankly, it seems like a really great investment to me. So some of the most relevant tools to today's topic that you can find in the Machinery's toolbox include a guide for bylaws and bylaw amendments. There's also a board nomination form as well as a board member agreement. There is also an introductory guide for your board members to get them started once you've brought them on board. No pun intended. There is as well a board meeting agenda and board meeting minute templates, in addition to just a general governance toolkit, which is really useful, and of course an annual budget for arts organizations, really to name just a few. I do really encourage you to have a look at their site and see what other useful tools are there, because there might be stuff that is really useful to you right now, even before you get involved in that registration process. Just sort of a final note on preparing these documents. People often assume that they need a lawyer to look over these documents before submitting them. Not necessarily. If you feel more comfortable and you have access to one, by all means, but it's really not essential, particularly if you follow some existing models. So once you've registered and created all your necessary documents, there are still some responsibilities you'll need to keep in mind for your organization moving forward. So first, your organization will be obligated to hold an annual general meeting for your members. So this is basically an opportunity to present the year's financial statements, elect new board members, and if necessary, vote on any changes to your bylaws. So for example, we here at Alain are holding our AGM this coming Monday, albeit we'll be holding it remotely via Zoom this year, which will be a bit of a new experience. So second, after having to keep in mind your AGM, you'll also have to file an annual registration with either the federal or provincial body with whom you're registered, as well as pay the accompanying fee. So for example, if you're registered in Quebec, you would have to file to renew your Quebec Enterprise Number, or NEQ, with the registraire at the cost of $35. You'll also have to file any necessary tax documentation depending on your situation. So for a lot of organizations, that will really just be an information return. For others, depending on the value of your assets held or any other sort of very particular considerations, other forms may be required. And of course, beyond these very explicit obligations, you'll also just have to do a lot of work to maintain the overall well-being and stability of your organization. And of course, part of that entails securing funding for your work. So with that in mind, let's actually take a look at some of the grants that you'll be eligible for as a not-for-profit organization. First, we'll take a look at one of CALC's programs for operating funding. One thing to keep in mind before we go any further, to be eligible for CALC's grants for organizations, so not just this one, but across the board, your organization must be headquartered in Quebec. And as I mentioned before, you'll need to ensure that the majority of your board members are Canadian citizens living in Quebec or permanent residents in the province. So for this program, which is called Operating Funding for Creation and Production Organizations, this program is actually presently closed because they run on a 4-year cycle. Last deadline was in February of 2017, but we'll take a look just to give you an idea of what this type of program offers. So this one is available to performing arts disciplines, but there are of course equivalent programs for visual and media arts, as well as for literature. So over the course of a 4-year period, it can cover up to 50% of the total annual revenues in that period. To be eligible, your organization is going to need to have been active in its discipline for at least 5 years. Beyond that, you need to demonstrate sound organizational structure, as well as a high level of human and technical resources. Your organization also needs to have a significant number of activities, as well as revenues that are favorable compared to other organizations, either in your field or your territory. So as you can see, for some fairly significant funding, you do really need to demonstrate a proven track record over at least a 5-year period to really stand out. So if there's something you're aiming for down the line, it's important to start building a strong case by creating a stable organization with solid administration that can pursue its mandate successfully. Beyond CALC, there are other provincial funders in the arts that you can look at. For example, SODEC typically caters more to for-profit businesses in industries like film and television, music, and publishing. But I will highlight this particular program. This is a project grant which is particular to COVID-19 and is actually available to not-for-profits. So this program is actually a new subsection of an existing program called Aide aux initiatives innovantes. This particular subsection is called Aide aux projets de relance culturelle, so support for cultural relaunch projects. It runs until March 31st of 2021, and it's really all about supporting organizations in the production and presentation of concerts, events, and sort of other cultural content under social distancing conditions to help with the overall relaunch of the arts and culture sector. So this can either be through capture and streaming of events, events that take place in converted spaces so that they allow for safe social distancing, or events that make use of public space. So really quite open to a variety of potential projects. Funding available can cover up to 75% of project costs to a maximum of $150,000. So really quite significant. Depending on the kind of work you're doing and the scope of your project, something like this can provide funding really beyond what is available to individual artists and collectives, I would say. But beyond more possibilities just in arts and culture, not-for-profit status also opens up a lot of options for funding from other sectors. In compiling documentation on all the available provincial funding that's out there, as Guy mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, out of the over 130 programs that we've identified in total, 18 of those programs are from various ministries and provincial agencies outside of arts and culture. So those include Emploi Quebec, which has 4 programs, including a wage subsidy program to hire temporary staff, which can be super helpful for small organizations with a small staff. The Ministry of Tourism has 6 programs for organizations whose work has a tourism component. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs has 2 programs, one with a focus on organizations in the regions, another focused more on the metropolitan area. The Société d'Habitation du Québec has a program to improve the accessibility of small establishments as well as small meeting places. So that's to name just a few. If you'd like to know more or sort of look at our funding research in general, there's a link in the slides to our searchable funding platform. Please check it out and have a look. But yeah, based on this admittedly brief survey, you now have a better idea of the kinds of programs that are out there. So I'm sure some of you are thinking, great, I've got this information on how to register. I've got this information on all these funding options, but I could still use a hand getting started. And that's totally understandable. All the more so because we have the resources that are available to help you do that. And we can do that in a couple of ways. So first, in terms of individual consultations, and that's whether you have questions about registering as a not-for-profit that are specific to your situation, or you'd like to know more about the grants that would be relevant to you once you've registered. We can schedule a one-on-one consultation to discuss that in greater detail. So particularly when it comes to finding funding, regardless of people's experience level, researching those grants is an issue. And that can be either, sort of lack of experience, just finding the whole situation kind of intimidating, which is totally understandable. But even if you're more experienced, it could just be a matter of not having the time to do that. So through Quebec Relations, we're really focused on providing these consultations in order to simplify and facilitate that grant application process and encourage more people to submit new applications. So as we mentioned earlier, this is a service we primarily offer to organizations, but if you're interested now, I am able to offer some guidance for individual artists and collectives. Really the best thing you can do is just reach out to get in touch. We can schedule a Zoom or a phone call. That'll allow me to learn a bit more about your situation, your goals in registering as a not-for-profit, and any funding you may already be taking advantage of, as well as your sort of funding needs for the future. At which point I can get back to you after a bit of research with a list of relevant funding options. We can then sort of discuss that and fine-tune that based on your feedback. So let's say we've had a funding consultation. Things are a little clearer to you, either in terms of the registration process or which organizational funding you want to apply for. Obviously, knowing is only half the battle. You still have to either register or then submit your application once you are registered. So regardless of your experience level, for any organization that's looking to apply for provincial funding, we can help you with subsidized grant writing and editing assistance to make sure you put your best foot forward. In this case, it's not a service we can offer for free to individual artists who are not yet registered as not-for-profits, but it is available according to June Park's standard rates if you're interested in pursuing that. However, as a complementary to this service, we can provide free assistance with registering your not-for-profit to help you make the process as painless as possible and to get you started on that path to accessing funding for organizations. So with that in mind, I'll let June tell you a bit more about her services and just let you know how you can get started.
Thank you, Nick. I thought that was a really thorough and logical step-by-step presentation for how to get incorporated. It really is not as daunting as some people seem to think it is. And I think that's one of the main reasons for ELAN to have this particular webinar session is that it is something that you can do on your own. Like Nick said, you don't need a lawyer, but taking care with all of your documents is of course important. It's exactly the same as with an application for a grant. If you are missing numbers, if you fill things in incorrectly, they will reject the application. That's just one thing to note, that they do like their paperwork done properly as would be expected. What I do, I'm just part of the ELAN team here to support Quebec relations and really pleased to do so to be able to help out organizations and individuals both with the grant writing. So once, I mean, artists of course can apply for the Quebec grants on their own, but as a not-for-profit, as Nick was saying, there are a lot more open doors to look at. I did just want to mention that charitable status, which is harder to get in my opinion, but still possible, also opens up the doors for all the Quebec foundations that are out there and federal foundations, because just as a not-for-profit, even though you are registered as a not-for-profit, you can't accept foundation money. And that's something that some organizations might be interested in, especially if you have some sorts of ties to current foundations. But yeah, all I can say is Nick will let you know. So if you get in touch with Nick first, he'll be able to assess your situation, tell you what he thinks you need. And if you're in a position where you're going to be applying and where you could actually use some active help, then Nick will be able to refer you to me. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me. It's just junepark@elan-quebec.org, and I'll be really happy to answer them. But I think Nick's presentation is awesome and very thorough. Hopefully all the information you need is here. Thanks.
Thanks, June. So on that note, that actually brings us to the end of today's presentation and to our question period.